Welcome to the Level Up Podcast. My name is Brandon Snipes, and today we're sitting down with Eric Parker. He's a professor of theology. He grew up biracial in the South, in Alabama, and therefore has a really unique perspective on everything from faith to critical race theory, which we will be getting into today. Stay tuned. Eric Parker, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Glad to have you coming on. You're somebody I've wanted to sit down and talk to for a long time, and I'm glad you were able to finally make that work.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So that's great. So what are you currently up to job-wise, career-wise?
Yeah, I'm actually a professor at an upstart college here in Birmingham, which has been incredibly rewarding, exciting to see things from the beginning, helping craft and form them. And so that's taken most of my time. I've just created an entire class over the summer from scratch, which has been an interesting, really experiment in thinking about education and what it means to form the mind and how people really learn. So that's been fun and exciting. But yeah, I've been doing that since October, and I'm very fortunate because it's not an easy, being a professor is not an easy job to get.
Yeah, that's extremely awesome. And can I ask, what are you a professor of? What are you teaching?
Yeah, I'm a theology professor. So I'm teaching Christian theology. We teach a worldview class which is a little bit of ethics, a little bit of just sociology, obviously a little bit of theology, just understanding how people think from different perspectives and what frames out their understanding of the world, how they put those pieces together and make sense of the world around them. There's what we call a missiology class, just from a Christian's perspective, how do we best communicate our beliefs in such a way that they would be hopefully endearing to others and persuade them to believe. And so that's actually the class that I just pioneered. And then some other classes.
So while that missiology, that's
That's right,
is
yeah.
fresh on your mind, without me having to pay tuition, give me, that's fascinating. And this is a big question. I think a lot of people are turned off by a certain abrasive approach by Christians, et cetera. So what would be some principles in that class that you would see as being effective?
Yeah, I mean, something I was thinking about today, actually, a guy named Sam Chan wrote a book on evangelism. And one of the things he talks about, and you could see this in another scholar, his name's D.A. Carson, he wrote a book where he mentioned the idea or the concept of plausibility structures. And what that is, society has these structures, if you can imagine, like a structure upholding a building, structures upholding certain beliefs and worldviews, things that seem to make sense naturally, intuitively when you talk to someone, right? What's plausible, basically, in that society, what's not plausible. So if you say, hey, a UFO landed in my backyard, once you come see it, you're probably not going to come out of your way because it's not plausible, right? And this has nothing to do with veracity, with truth.
Yes.
Whether or not these things are true, it's just whether or not they seem reasonably sound or possible.
Yeah.
And so he talks about part of what makes up these plausibility structures in our society are community, experience, and facts or data. And the most significant one, at least he argues, Sam Chan argues, is actually community. That if you're in a community of people where certain things are normal and normalized and other things are not, then it's very hard for different ideas to enter in and seem reasonable or plausible, even when you can bring in facts, even when you can talk about people's experiences. Which we can get into that even later into some of our discussion. But so I think from a Christian perspective, in order to approach people in a way that doesn't first delegitimize their understanding of the world, I think part of our goals and our purposes and our strategies for success are really to see where they have legitimate views of the world from a Christian perspective, and to help imbue that with even more meaning, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Before we're trying to tear something down, we need to really to show the goodness of what we call common grace, that we're all made in the image of God and have certain proclivities towards the right, the good, and the beautiful. And so let's connect on those things and then talk about why these other things would be reasonable next steps to believe in, and why maybe even the belief that you have isn't actually reasonable or the most reasonable under the worldview that you currently hold.
Yeah.
Which is a different perspective from what you saw in the 20th century, when it felt like Christianity was part of the majority culture and you had the moral majority, and it was very political. And I mean, Billy Graham was the personal advisor to multiple presidents. Whereas today, increasingly, we're in a post-Christian context. It's not fully there, but where Christians are very much in the minority in terms of what we believe. And that is more true to the history of the world before Christendom, to where the church originated out of the first and to some degree the second century. And so I personally feel more comfortable having a conversation and a coffee with someone who's not a Christian. I'd take that any day over someone who's culturally kind of Christianized, if you will, in the South, for instance, the Bible Belt, anywhere you might find yourself, who sort of would say, hey, I'm a Christian, I go to church, but in no other meaningful way would you recognize them to be a person who says they believe these fundamental truths or these historic orthodox truths about who Jesus is and what he's done.
So even as far as plausibility structures, you would say that the cultural Christian doesn't necessarily have those same plausibility structures. Like, how would you think, if you're going into a conversation, why is it that you'd rather sit down with somebody who is not the cultural Christian?
Because I think there's no pretense when it comes to the person who's not the cultural Christian. They have no reason, no desire, no need to put up airs or pretend. And so you're a lot more clear on what they think, what they feel. Oftentimes, cultural Christians have just never thought deeply about what they think, and a lot of times they live with the cognitive dissonance of what they say they believe and what they truly want or how they truly live, and they never really go further to try to resolve that dissonance. It just is the state of existence for them. And so part of the job then becomes trying to use the same language that they would understand just culturally to help them understand that they are a lot further from this than they really realize. That it's just such a monumental task to do that. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's been the majority. I didn't grow up as a Christian. I was Catholic, actually, and that was just very loosely. Just my mother took me to Catholic church and Mass until I was about 13. I never even heard of like anything else. I didn't know there were Protestants or let alone Baptists. That's kind of where I hail from most recently. And so, when I became a Christian, it was out of really fundamentally a secular, non-Christian background. I couldn't have told you who Jesus was at the time before I started going to church for the first time. And so everything was new to me. Everything was fresh. And honestly, in many ways today, I'm in my 30s now, and I still feel like an outsider, and I've been a Christian for 20-something years.
Do you think that would be the experience of most people raised Catholic? And without stepping on too many toes, to what degree do you think that was your particular congregation you're a part of as opposed to the faith writ large? Because not everyone would draw a distinction between Christian and Catholic.
Yeah, that's right. And I don't know that I'm comfortable. Some people would, but I don't know that I'm comfortable drawing a hard and fast distinction. There's pretty significant belief differences between Protestants and Catholics, particularly around the doctrine of justification. Justification is how we understand our rightness or our standing before God, whether we're in the clear, as it were, or whether or not we've still got some issues that He's going to hold against us. And I'm not I'm not up in my Catholic theology, so for all of you Catholics out there, forgive me if I'm caricaturing, but my best understanding from what's on paper And that's different necessarily than what your average Catholic might say, just as much as it's different from what your average Protestant might say. But on paper, and which is what you have to judge anything by, because it's the most objective standard and measurement, justification, the Protestant, what came out of the Reformation and kind of the axiom was that justification is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And so basically it's nothing that you can do. There's no works that you can contribute, but it is merely by the sovereign grace of God who comes to you and calls you into salvation out of love, but not out of the fact that you are lovely or that you have in some way earned or merited some attention from him or this reward. In Catholic theology, there is this moment that comes through baptism where you essentially are somewhat saved or brought into the church, brought into the ecclesia. But if your works don't basically add up at the end of all of that, then you will not have been ultimately justified. So there's like a beginning justification at the beginning of your journey in Catholicism through baptism, and then there's a sort of culmination of that on the final day of judgment. And what you did in between matters.
Yeah, so you could say that the initial justification is a down payment of sorts.
That's right.
But did you continue to make the payments on this?
That's
and
really
maybe this is a way of wrestling with this James's proclamation that faith without works is dead.
Yeah.
And which Christians of all sorts will wrestle with.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to come back to this level of presuppositions that you were talking about, and you said those were called
plausibility structures.
Plausibility structures, and so maybe that's similar to the idea of a worldview in some ways, but in more pointed.
Yeah,
or
that's
it's almost like a Kantian grid in some ways.
It's a subset, really, of the topic of worldview.
Of worldview, yeah. So that makes sense. And I think practically speaking, it'd be neat to drill down here. The thing I was thinking about when you brought this up was just echo chambers, particularly with social media. You have, if it is the case that our knowledge of what's plausible and what works is primarily shaped by that community element and those you're around, right? What's the quote? You're the mean average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, or something like that. So say you find yourself in this situation that a lot of these conversations take place without recognizing that they might not have this. You're trying to build a house for somebody and they don't have the right foundation or the necessary foundation to accept that particular belief.
Yeah.
So when you think about engaging with someone, are you trying to intentionally go deeper and recognize what are your worldview foundations? Have you found that that's changed the way you interact with people?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that started for me in college, where, my particular major was communication studies. It was one of the most liberal majors on campus. I loved it. It was great. One of my professors from that time, maybe the most liberal person that I know, but I loved him and I love him now. Mm-hmm. Just an amazing professor who really invested in me. But I found that oftentimes I was the only Christian in my class of a lot of times 15 or 20. And we were talking about things like, obviously, same-sex marriage before it was a public discussion. We were talking about transgenderism before it was in the public universe of ideas, really. Obviously, we were talking about race and so many other things. And I was really forced for the first time, like, how do I communicate about these ideas around the small group of people that are not Christians and not be laughed out of the room, and yet at the same time not compromise what I believe or the convictions that I hold. And so this has been an ongoing process for me. Tim Keller's been very helpful. He was a pastor in New York City who planted a church there, and it grew to thousands because he really worked on understanding the culture of New York City. And his basic notion is that you have A doctrines and B doctrines, and I might get this switched a little bit because it's been a minute since I've read them, but you have A doctrines and B doctrines, and there are, we'll just say, B doctrines that your average person would affirm. So like justice, for instance. We all cry out for justice, and this is a big topic today. But there are A doctrines that they would not accept if you brought them up. And so the notion then is, how do I find those B doctrines that would be really common to most of us, and then make those like a boat, if you will, in the communication river, and put the A doctrines on the boat and say, hey, if you think the B doctrine makes sense, well, let me show you why.
Wouldn't this logically follow?
And this
will help you actually be more consistent.
And this
want you to double down on what you believe.
It will be more fulfilling for you. It will make you feel more whole. And so I want to bring consistency into your life. And so that's really...
So an example of that might be, say someone believes justice as a broad boat.
Yeah.
You say fantastic. And then they're maybe not all the way to the point of saying why that justice should exist. Exactly. And that's where you drill down to say, what if the foundation for this, what can really help this boat float is this idea that we are created in the image of God. I mean, these were some of the doctrines that underpin the Constitution, and that we are created equal precisely because of this. But now you're building something on top of something you agreed with, and maybe you invite the person to try to, well, how do you talk about this doctrine? How do you support this? What are your foundations here? Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Yeah, man. So take me back here, and how did you get into the academic life? Were you always a curious kid in the areas of philosophy and theology? And how did your life lead you here?
I'd say I've always been a curious kid.
Okay.
But not necessarily in those areas. I didn't even know those areas were areas for a long time. But I mean, it might be helpful just to take you back even further to, I'm from Montgomery, Alabama. I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. My mom is white and my dad is black. And I vividly remember living in a bad part of Montgomery, walking into the local Winn-Dixie and seeing these white people staring at me and my mom when I was probably 4, maybe 5 years old. And me turning to my mom and say, "Why are they staring at us, Mom?" And that began, that's the first moment of what I guess I would call like race consciousness that I had, that there was something different, in some ways about myself. And from there, my mom did a great job of, explaining lots of phenomenon, particularly racist phenomenon that I, encountered.
Because I'm sure there was no shortage of race consciousness she'd experienced.
Oh man, her family, her parents were less than accepting of my existence and her relationship with my father, who was pretty quickly out of the picture. And so for the first year, probably, she was completely on her own with me and my older brother, who's white, actually.
From your father's previous relationship?
From my mother.
Oh, your mother's, rather.
Yeah, that's right. From my mother's previous relationship. That's right. So, but I've just had the interesting experience of growing up in a noticeably hostile environment in some ways. I can't count on how many times I've been called the N-word. I've literally been, kept from dating white girls because their parents wouldn't allow them to, this sounds crazy to people, if you're not from the South and you're not biracial, but this was normal, and so at the same time, that caused me in many ways to be a reflective person, because I had a lot of challenges that I had to process. Not having
identity didn't come as an easy default.
Exactly.
There weren't a whole lot of examples to slot your identity into.
None. I didn't know of
Did you
another
have biracial friends?
No.
Or, yeah.
I mean, I was the only person that I knew that was biracial growing up. Not having dad, you kind of think about that.
What would you say the breakdown of your friends' demographic was? Mostly white, mostly black?
It skewed white, and we can talk about reasons for that. But not having dad growing up in Montgomery and constantly having kind of people looking and saying things and having to think about that. I have a brother who experienced some challenges when he was in high school, but I was still a kid. And I observed all that, and it's somewhat traumatic. And so having to process that, and so life really has put me in the position of having to process. And then as you start to go through puberty and, start liking girls, and you start to find that for some reason these girls don't like you that you like, then you have experiences on both sides of the spectrum. So there's the racist side of, how whites have sometimes treated me, but then there's the racist side of how blacks have sometimes treated me, like, oh, you're just acting white. And this is a common thing. If you're black and you showed an interest in education, in using what some would call proper grammar or proper English.
You wouldn't call it that?
Well, it's not. I call it that. Yeah,
but it is a
I'm
scare quote sort of
acknowledging
thing.
that other people would take
contentious-
issue with that, and would say that Black English and Ebonics is a legitimate, category that we should not necessarily discourage.
And that proper English might just be a continued form of colonization.
Yeah,
say.
that's right. Yeah. And so, but if you exhibited those kind of features, then you were acting white, and you were made fun of. You were marginalized
mainly by the black community.
Mainly by at least in my experience, and as I've heard other black people like me, whether they were biracial or like 100% African American, those who valued education, loved learning, blah blah blah. Their experience was just the same as mine. They had to sort of hide the fact that they loved, reading, for instance, or, liked math, which again, we can talk about this later, but that's a significant problem. So I was experiencing the fact that I didn't fit in either group at some level. And so if I don't fit in as black, and if I don't fit in as white without having to change who I am, I could have changed and dumbed down how I talked and what I was interested in and fit in with my black friends, change how I dress. I could have, denied certain aspects of myself and maybe, made a better name for myself, carved out something better in sort of my white friends circles. But I didn't want to do that. And so I was left with a tension of being both white and black and realizing that the world very rarely is as black and white as we'd like to make it.
Yeah. That's such a complicated issue. It's no small thing to ask somebody to turn their back on their culture. That's maybe a harsh way of saying it. But to someone who has proclivities that are outside of their cultural norm, and I'm not making a generalization about all black culture is this, but at least the one that you were a part of.
That's right.
Your desires were they kind of went against the grain of the cultural norm, and it's no small thing to ask somebody. I mean, there's so much stabilizing power in going with the flow of your culture and the cultural norms. So that is a real difficult problem, if you want to call it a problem. That the things that we know help get people out of poverty. Yeah. The things that help people think. Having a vocabulary, having words to attach ideas to, is the most brilliant and profound way of expanding your mind to solve problems. You need concepts, you need words.
Yeah.
And so to have somebody afraid to expand their vocabulary, to use that example, whether that's proper English or whatever it is, to adopt a linguistic structure that would help lift them out practically. Yeah. Or give them tools.
Yeah. Just to go a little deeper on that, and I'm going to get these numbers somewhat wrong, but, in your inner city kind of context, your most impoverished parts of America, whether they're black or white, the best that we can tell, social scientists can tell, is that the lowest levels of society, kids are hearing about 600 words per hour. Blue collar workers, their kids are hearing somewhere around 1,200. And middle class families, their kids are hearing about 2,100 to 2,400 words per hour. Now, if you were to extrapolate that out,
across a childhood,
that's significant, because, as you said, these are the fundamental building blocks of a person's conceptual reality. Literally, what they form as being possible in the world is limited by the number of words they can use to bring it into being.
Yes, and I've encountered research that there is a direct line that it is an extremely powerful predictor of success. Financial success, economic success. That one of the greatest predictors is how many words are you being exposed to as a child.
Not only that, but in these same categories that we're talking about, and I don't remember the numbers on this, but it's alarming and discouraging that in the lowest levels, not are they just hearing less words, but they're actually hearing more words of a negative connotation directed towards them, and fewer words of a positive affirmation towards them. And that shifts as you go up to the middle class, where it's completely inverted, where they're hearing much more positive affirmations and much less negative affirmations.
So what would be an example of a negative affirmation?
Stop. Okay. No.
Things that are placing roadblocks in their natural development.
I mean, it could be just as simple as mom and dad. Well, that's going too far. Grandma, in that scenario, in the lowest levels, because moms and dads typically aren't there, or often are semi-absent. Grandma is doing all she can. She didn't think she'd be raising grandbabies. She thought she'd raise, her kids and then be done, but now she's raising grandbabies, and she's not able to retire. She's working, she's tired, and, a kid being a kid, all she has energy to do is say, no, you can't do that. No, don't touch that. Boy, get over here, blah, blah, blah. And so when your entire world and your interactions are framed by that, and then they actually have something positive to bring to you, but you're so tired to even notice that then they just get another no. You're even stamping down. You're not even just saying no to negative behaviors. Now you're saying no to what could be potential strengths and things to
Here's
encourage.
A kid who's enthusiastically wanting to explore the world.
Here's a drawing. Look at this.
And worse than no, it might be the kind of proclamations I hear a lot from just stressed parents are proclamations over an identity of a kid. Why are you so this? Why are you always like this?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that goes much deeper than a no, because it's grounding it in, here's who you are.
Yeah.
And you're someone who's annoying to me.
But the important thing is that the frequency and the ratios of that trend drastically negative at the lower ends of the socioeconomic ladder, and drastically positive at the higher ends.
Now, I'd be interested to think about that in from a Korean perspective. I think there are stereotypes of tiger moms or these kind of things. I'm just going from pulling from my grandmother, but I probably heard more negative. But the difference is the culture is rooted in. So you get the negative. Here's the negative. Why you aren't a doctor? Okay, so that's negative. But there's also a standard that's being thrown in there.
That's right.
That deals with upward mobility.
Important. Yeah.
So it's a different sort of negative statement, I guess.
That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting to think through. Man, so if you're a parent out there, which you're a parent,
that's right.
Are you conscious of that? Trying to expose not only positive affirmations, but a lot of words.
Yeah. No, I catch myself all the time in terms of. My youngest is more mischievous than my oldest, and she likes to just get into all kinds of things that she knows she shouldn't do. And so sometimes I just have to just walk back things that I say and say, no, Daddy didn't mean that. You are this, and catch myself. So along that line, it is a challenge, and you have to think about the kind of world that you're building for them of who they could be, who they are.
Yeah.
I don't want to treat my kids based on who they are today. I want to treat them on who I think they are going to be tomorrow. You know. But then in terms of just the number of words, I mean, words are very important to me. I have somewhat of an extensive vocabulary of words pop out of my head that yeah, where did that come from? I don't remember the last time
You
that
read
I
it
used
once,
that,
5 years
you know,
ago.
just, and because I just love words. And so I read to my kids every single night. You know,
Shakespeare.
right now we're reading C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia.
Awesome. How old are they?
6 and 4, so it's a
Okay.
little above. I mean, they can comprehend if I go slower and then stop and talk about things. They really follow that. If I just read, then they don't necessarily comprehend everything, so it's a little above their comprehension level. But we have other books that we read too that are right where they need to be. And then my son is starting to read.
Well, so in educational psychology, Vygotsky, this educational psychologist, coined the term the zone of proximal development, and this kind of idea that there's a zone that's just out of the you couldn't understand, say, with the words, you couldn't understand the word by yourself, but you can reach that zone with assistance. And he says this is the optimal zone for learning. So if you just talk to the kids at gaga goo goo gaga, they're not going to. What do? You talk just out of reach. And this is the zone that everyone thrives in, as they're reaching up with assistance. And so it sounds like that C.S. Lewis might be somewhere hovering near that zone.
I'm hoping so. Yeah. So yeah, we put a high priority. I'm fortunate enough to have something of a personal library at home, and I think that in and of itself is sending a message to my kids that books are important in a day when most people don't have physical books anymore. We have our Kindles. We have, if we read it all, it's in short form kind of articles that we skim, don't even read all the way. And so I try to purposely position myself as well so that my kids see me reading, not just reading to them, but they'll come in the morning when they get up and they'll see Daddy either reading his Bible or reading a book or something, because I want their world to be as large as possible. And I think that's going to happen primarily through books.
And you're also adding supports to their plausibility structures. Because you're the near to them. You're the community to them, that part of their plausibility structure now involves the plausibility of the Bible being true. Because they see that and they encounter that regularly. So here you are, young man, in love with words, in love with learning, caught between these cultures. And where do you go from there?
So caught between the cultures, very curious. I would say my love affair with learning has been developmental. As my world has gotten bigger, then my thirst and my hunger for learning has gotten bigger. And so I get to college, do communication studies, begin to see how out of sync my beliefs are with my peers, as I said, and start to feel like some of my gifts are more intellectually oriented, but also communication oriented and just communicating with people. And so I moved towards a path of vocational or full-time ministry that is like working in a church setting. And
so you were affected enough by your experience your positive experience with the church that you thought, this is something I'd want to go into vocationally.
Yeah, it took a while. It was that happened. I became a Christian when I was basically in the 7th grade. I never thought I would work in a church or do ministry, as they say, as a job. Like, that was the furthest. I mean, people they often said to me, "You're going to be a pastor," but I thought, you're just saying that because you're a cultural Christian and you've never seen someone who genuinely believes this stuff.
Mr. Holy over here,
And I felt like I just genuinely believe this stuff. I don't think that means I need to. And honestly, I think that was true at the time, but in college, God continued to work in my life in a way that it really compelled me to say, I care about the world around me. I care if I really believe what the Bible says is true about heaven and hell, which, the average listener might scoff at that. But I think it has to be taken seriously. If I say I believe this, then I should have a life that really corresponds to that. Evangelism makes sense if these things are true. And I say that I believe them. I do. And for me, the route at the time was, becoming a pastor. So I do a master's degree in what they call a Master's of Divinity, and it's kind of a broad master's covering everything from theology, ethics, philosophy, biblical languages. So I've had 12 hours, which is 4 semesters of both Koine Greek and ancient Hebrew, a little bit of Latin in there, and just going through and I went to one of the, and this is not to say anything about me, honestly, it was somewhat easy to get into the school, which is kind of funny, but I went to one of the best divinity schools in the country, and which means it was really hard, and it challenged me at every level intellectually, because again, as a Christian, you don't have the luxury of just assuming like, oh, this is all fine, like, I just believe it,
Yeah.
So I had to read Kant, I had to read Freud, I had to read Hume, and
maybe even more difficult, you had to read the liberal biblical scholars and the German intellectuals,
that's
the
absolutely
deconstructionists, etc.
I wasn't allowed in this context, in this school, because it was such a high caliber. I wasn't allowed to hide from those things, or even just read secondary sources from Christians. We had to read primary sources and then discuss them and think about them. So I wasn't able to be shielded from them. And that, I think, was a huge part of my intellectual development and hunger. And then actually after leaving, I began to feel even more of a desire there felt like such a distance between so many Christians. They can kind of live in their own communities, as we talked about community being these oftentimes these echo chambers. Christians can live that way and be so disconnected from the rest of the world, from politics, from culture, from just different worldviews, and I just felt like I couldn't, in good conscience, live in the world and not try to bridge that gap. And so I started reading a lot more on kind of the intersection between culture and Christianity, the best thinkers that I could find that were speaking in that space, and that led me towards more of a trajectory of politics, of ethics, of philosophy. And so the last probably 3 or 4 years, I've just I've been a student, not a student formally, academically in that sense, but just really a concerned citizen, someone who has a stake in this country for the future of America and has a responsibility in a democratic republic to contribute and to uphold the values, to call us to our own standards and our own vision, and then honestly, as a African American, for all intents and purposes, I have a responsibility when I see certain things being racialized that I don't think are fundamentally racial. And so all of that it's been this intellectual journey. It's been it's also been living between two worlds. It's been living not just between black and white two worlds, but also between Christianity and wider social engagement. And you can't be sort of uninterested of a person and be able to affect change and help people.
And to use the term intersectionality, maybe in a different context here,
Okay.
that you currently exist experientially at the intersection of so many hot button issues.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of religion,
That's right.
you intersect there. In terms of race, in terms of politics and political theory, these are all interest to you. So we've got to open that can up, if that's okay, and talk particularly about, as a concerned citizen, with the level of learning and the research you've done, the reading you've done. Maybe this is maybe a broad question, but diagnose where you see yourself with that where you see the country at that intersection right now. Particularly as it relates to race and that conversation. Right now, there's a lot of tension. I'll tell you what, let me do this. I was doing some reading on critical race theory today, and I want to read to you a few quotes from people. I'm not going to name names or anything, but these are, what is critical race theory, and here's what people say, okay?
Okay.
So I'm just going to throw a bunch of stuff out here.
Okay, that's great.
Quote, "The whole purpose of critical race theory is to provide Americans with a way to understand the legacy of racism, even though those stories sometimes hurt." Another quote, It's anti-American training that vilifies white people and demands they apologize. That might have been from Fox and Friends. Here's another one. It's the best learning for our students for social studies where they can really grapple with and come to a deeper understanding of our past that informs our present. Okay, here's another quote. Revisionist wokeism. Another quote. It robs people of the American dream. So clearly these are, and I would say a lot of Americans who are paying attention find themselves embodying one or the, there's not a whole lot of middle ground in those perspectives.
Yeah.
And so whatever this is, clearly a hot button issue.
Yeah. And
how have you at the Crossroads thought through this stuff?
Man, it is. And 6 months ago, no one in, the public really knew anything about CRT, as we'll just call it for short, critical race theory, CRT. I've been thinking about it intensely for about 6 months, and I thought I would try to maybe do further formal academic study in it. I'm not sure if I'm going to go that route now, but yeah, there's these two sides that tend to be fairly extreme. I think that what you hear in the sympathetic side of CRT is, and again, if we're being generous, this for them is a legitimate way of understanding our nation's history of racism and our current moment in the disparities that we see between primarily blacks and whites. I think that for them, we talk about being in community as one of the three things that form plausibility structures. In a community that sees CRT that way, it can often really be not just one way in which we understand history, economics, education, politics, and race in all of that, but it can be the way. It seems to be in many of our, so there's one guy who's done a lot of reporting on this, tons of documents that he's been able to collect. His name's Christopher Rufo. And, some people, he's this radical conservative. He actually used to be like a Marxist liberal, just fairly radical. And he kind of evolved into something more akin to a conservative.
Yeah.
But
which those are the kind of, as an aside, the kind of intellectuals I'm more inclined to listen to, because it means that they're not dealing in the world of straw men, and that they actually embodied the other idea at one point.
That's right. And a cursory listen to him, you could hear him say, we've got to fight this war against CRT, we've got to get it out of our schools, and so on and so forth. And the person who's either unknowledgeable or sympathetic towards CRT hears him say, he doesn't want to think about the negative racial past that we have. He
thinks everything is hunky-dory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or that he doesn't want to permit certain ideas.
Yeah.
And if you listen
it's an assault on free speech.
That's right. If you listen to him and read him really not even closely, if you just generously read and read more than one thing, you'll clearly see that he's not against the idea or the theory of critical race theory. That's exactly what it is. It's a theory. It's a outlook. At this point, it's becoming a worldview. He's not against that being one of a menu of possible outlooks or ways in which we understand our national identity and our past and our present. But he's against it being the sole way in which we understand that.
So the suggestion there would be that there is actually something uniquely offered, at least a thing uniquely offered by critical race theory that you couldn't get somewhere else.
I'd have to think about that further. I think there are helpful things in it. Primarily, one thing that comes to mind is the idea or the notion of intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw sort of coined this term. Intersectionality is essentially posits that a individual, a minority, may have multiple minority identities that overlap in their one person. So that you sort of alluded to this with me, but to take a more stark example, you might have a woman, okay, so that's a minority, in some ways, in the sense that women are viewed as being less powerful and less enfranchised than men in our society.
Okay, so the whole intersectional idea is operating under the idea that there is a hierarchy of empowerment.
That's right.
And because, you might ask, well, it's obvious that people are part of different groups. Why do you need this whole
That's right.
concept to explain that? People have always known people have different life experiences.
That's right.
Why label it as something? So what's the purpose of the labeling?
Yeah, so this woman may not just be a woman, she may also be black, which then adds another layer of minority status, and I'm going to come back and add a qualifier to that. And then she may also be possibly transgender or lesbian. Maybe it's possible to be both of those. Mm-hmm. I'm not exactly sure, but that's 3 layers deep now. So
she's getting progressively more disenfranchised by the system.
By the systems that are at play in American society, which, according to critical race theory, are designed and purposed to advantage at the top white heterosexual men.
Yes, and they would say, that self-evidently because look who's at the top.
Right.
Would that be kind of the idea? Or look who's traditionally been at the top?
That would probably be part of it. They would probably not start there. They'd probably say, look who's at the bottom.
Okay.
That would be their starting point.
And that would protect against, if you say, well, look, black president, they would say, okay, yeah, that's the exception that proves the rule.
Yes.
Look at the bottom here. And that really demonstrates what's going on.
And they would see all of these genuine and awful disparities between blacks and whites at the bottom, where blacks feel, in many cases, a disproportionate amount to their relative population size, the socioeconomic bracket at the bottom, or in prison, or fill in the blank with whatever the topic is.
And that's an important distinction, because some might say, well, you got more white people on food stamps.
Yeah.
And you say, well, the important part is proportionate to their population.
That's right. So there's all kinds of ways we can chop this up and parse it out differently. So that's an important way that they think about it, is proportional representation. Mm-hmm. So the intersectionality claim is not just that, though. It's that the world is situated in a hierarchy of power, and that white heterosexual men are at the top of that power pyramid, and as you take on these minority identities, you get further and further down the bottom, marginalized. And intersectionality allows us to understand that a person can have multiple levels of oppression, and so then it becomes power and oppression. Power is used to coerce or to oppress. And so white men who are heterosexual at the top are almost by existence, almost by sense of being there.
Yeah, well, they're a gear that runs the machine.
And taking part in the system and advantaging themselves in the system are at the same time, whether advertently or inadvertently, are disadvantaging or oppressing those below them in the same system.
So one offered solution there might be abandon your post. I remember going shortly after Trump won the 2016 election. There was a roundtable discussion of Birmingham pastors, and there were probably something like 40 different churches in attendance, and I was so excited to go to this. And there was a panel discussion of a mixture of black and white pastors. And first, they went and introduced themselves and gave an example of how they'd experienced racism. And so for black people, it was like stories not unlike your own. And for the white people, it was examples of how they've seen people be racist to black people.
Yeah.
Right. As the night went on, how do we make things better? The answer given almost unanimously, and you could feel the support in the crowd there, was if you're a white person who owns property, give that property over to a black person. If you have material resources, and I've really struggled to understand that at first, but the way you laid out that structure and philosophy, you go, well, yeah, that logically follows. Yeah. They're saying you're part of the system. Your resources hoarded up here are taking resources from the people down here, and so unless you abandon your post here, then people can't move up.
And the system is designed to funnel those resources to those specific people at the top. So I say that it's helpful in that it for someone like me who has had to manage multiple identities and get a unique vantage point of walking through the world, I understand in some sense what it is to be white on the average, as it were, and we could unpack that. But also I understand in many ways what it is to be black and some of the negative experiences that go along with that. And that
You also understand a third category, probably best of all, which is to be biracial.
Yeah.
In a particular type of biracial.
Yes. Yeah. And that definitely colors the way that I walk through the world and understand things that happen to me. Something that I often point out to my close friends, but now all of you guys will be my close friends, is that there are people who I've never met before that maybe I travel in the universe, socially, at the same universe as them, as it were. I've never met them before, but we've been in the same room once, maybe, or something like that, and inevitably they'll say, "Oh yeah, like I know you. You're so and so," and they'll know things about me in some ways, and I will have never met them before, but they will think that we had met. And what I've come to realize after years of this happening over and over again is not that I'm just forgetful, which I can be with names, but I'm really good with people and faces, is that when you're an African American in a predominantly white context, you tend to be memorable. And so people.
So they were people that actually had met you.
Yeah, not met me like, hey, we shook hands.
Okay.
It was we were in the same room. We might have known some of the same people.
Yeah,
they saw me next to one of their friends, and that memory stuck with them. And so the next time we actually met in person, and I first saw them face to face, they felt as if we had actually met at this point, and that had never occurred. I am uniquely aware when I walk into a room where I'm the minority that I'm a minority. If I go to a banquet or a gala or something like that, I am uniquely aware that the people that look like me are those who are primarily serving me at the table, my food or my drinks or whatever else. So I'm uniquely aware of all of those things. I can't not be. It's hard to miss that. It's not lost on me.
And playing into that particular example, are you at least aware or concerned with what those people might be thinking about you, being on that end of things?
Well, just from having grown up and had the experience I've already talked about, there is the component of, what are they thinking right now? But that sometimes is also true of certain white people, if you want to say that, that might be in a different socioeconomic status than me. I came from nothing, and, through both hard work and I think the grace of God, I've been able to not necessarily arrive at some very, luxurious lifestyle, but far better than I ever imagined.
I remember at a school where I used to teach, one of the grounds, a white groundskeeper, he was a member of the, grounds crew, and he was given a PE position. So now he's technically a teacher, and I remember overhearing some of the grounds people talking to him, "Oh, Mr. Fancy here," right, and he was doubling down, going, "No, my collar's still blue. I'm still one of you."
Right.
And so even there was that tension.
Yeah. And I feel that sometimes in certain contexts. But all that to say, that aspect of intersectionality, the recognition and the credence to that people of different backgrounds can have different experiences, and those can be compounded by, if you want to say, the multiple identities that might be sort of present in that person. That's helpful, I think. It's been helpful for me just personally, at least I can say that. It'd be harder to extrapolate out how that might be helpful at maybe like a public policy level or something like that.
Well, I think one way it would be helpful, if you press that idea, it's basically, it is a big, that framework could be seen as supporting individualism and individual rights pretty strongly. At the core of that, if you follow it to the bottom, it's to say, yes, you're part of a group, but we're all part of many groups. And so really I have to contend with you as the individual that you are. And I can't sort you into a group category. So that could be used to say, in the eyes of the law, you stand as your individual self, and I can't label you and let the law act upon you based upon your group.
Yeah, well,
that's not how it's used.
I'm definitely, favorable towards that interpretation. But the aspect that I can't accept and bring in from critical race theory through intersectionality is the philosophical framework of power and oppression. I don't think that we can so easily divide or define our society by those fundamental frameworks or motivations. There's so many motivations that can be, if you just know yourself, and if you are yourself and you extend yourself out over a population. This is something that Kant would, obviously be familiar with the categorical imperative in some ways. But if you just extended yourself out, and in that sense, you were the most generous.
This is a great point. Sorry, to interrupt there, but to say your average person who is driving this thing that power runs the world, power is what motivates the people at the top. They would exclude themselves from that list.
That's right. So in extending yourself
or
out,
is it because they sense their desire for power that they project that on others? Which is it?
I would like to be favorable, generous, and say, that we all know power is not the fundamental determinant.
And can we define power really quick? Because in the past, I found it helpful to define it in a way that's not purely negative, which is what you say gets done.
Yeah.
And in that way, a beautiful person has a certain power.
Yeah.
Gandhi was powerful.
Yeah.
People who have a lot of money, that's a big form of power.
Yeah.
If you have the structural reins,
Yeah.
it's power. But to me, that is a bit of an equalizer in some ways. There's different forms of being powerful. But what do people mean when they say it's about power and oppression?
I think that's a helpful way to put it. I can't honestly say, I haven't read enough to be able to articulate in a confident way, to be honest. I would think, though, that they would look across all social metrics of flourishing, and those who are at the top end of flourishing have some form of power that can be leveraged or utilized to affect some sort of change in some way. Mm-hmm. That's what I would think. So I think some of the things that you pointed out would definitely fit in that category.
So ultimately what you're talking about is borrowing a bourgeois, proletariat, Marxist understanding of economic oppression and oppressed, and applying that to the racial atmosphere of the United States and other places in the world.
Again, this is the armchair, civically concerned person, but I think that's true. And honestly, I don't even say that as many would in a pejorative way. I know that there are liberally, and I mean that in the lowercase L, classical liberally minded people who would definitely lean towards more of a Marxist or socialist framework when it comes to healthcare or economics. Want something of like an augmented form of that, which we somewhat already actually have in our country, but maybe they would want it to be more pronounced. But otherwise have a classically liberal view of rights and responsibilities in society that would hold that view. And so I don't want to say that pejoratively, but I don't think you can look at the racial rhetoric of CRT and look at the intellectual history of it and what it's indebted to, and come away with anything but. It might be more than that, but it's not less than that. Yeah.
So am I right? Let me try to give a perspective from different sides of this issue. That one side might say, similar to some of the quotes I mentioned there, without addressing the past, this is a tool to address the trauma of the past. Without addressing that, the system, and therefore the individuals in the system, move forward limping, suffering from that generational structural trauma. Okay, so this is a tool that needs to be dealt with, not only from the past, but the way that the past is still embedded in the structures themselves, and we need to diagnose the structures. And we can't teach people to fish if the ponds they're fishing in have rotted fish. We need to fix the structures. And then another side that says, if we sort people into groups in this way, in such a strong way, we risk atomizing ourselves. No one can relate to anybody to the degree that we lose social cohesion completely and the social fabric dissolves. So, there's a reason people talk with such strong language, because the stakes, in their opinion, are so high. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the stakes are high, and I think that sounds like a fair characterization on either side of the discussion.
Mm. So where are you right now in thinking through, you've shared some thoughts here, but as your thoughts are developing, what are some of the big issues you're trying to still wrestle through and tackle? You mentioned you've been writing on this.
Yes, I have been writing in the privacy of my own home.
Yeah.
So nothing
By candlelight
yes,
with a quill.
That's right. Nothing that I've published, but just trying to clarify thoughts and push them out of the cloud of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, oh goodness, there's so many things. I think that as a citizen who lives in this country, it's important to recognize how you view the country, how you view its history, how you view its present, and how you view its future. I think it's important what you think about, our fundamental motto as a country, like e pluribus unum, out of many come one.
Yeah.
I think that this American experiment and this is I don't know if this has comments under it or what, but this be frowned upon. But I think in the best sense of the word, it is exceptional. Not that we are somehow ultimately endowed by God or something like that. But I think that never in the history of the world have you been able to take disparate cultures and ethnicities and peoples and put them together and last this long. Let's just put it very bluntly.
As far as the shelf life of a world, of a big world power nation, we're past the expiration date.
And have a modicum of freedom.
And,
so you think about the Roman Empire, for instance, and it was a fairly pluralistic and multicultural sort of empire, but the kind of freedom that you had pales in comparison to...
But freedom for who, Eric?
Yeah.
The rich white men.
That's right. And so, have we been on the struggle bus, as it were, since our inception and before? Absolutely. But I think that when we recognize, and again, I don't mean for this to be a quick trope, but I think it is just true that in the history of the world, which is a long history of societies and migrations and empires and all kinds of the history of the world, like slavery, for instance, was the norm. It was the expected state of things, that people would conquer another people and utilize them for their own personal gain and not afford to them the same status as their natural-born citizens. And that we had a document, and I'm thinking of the Declaration of Independence, that laid out a vision that even if I granted at the time of its writing, although I think historically you could show that there was struggle among the writers of the Declaration, even for this idea of like, hey, we've got slaves here and we're writing this, what do we do? But even if you said, no, they're all awfully racist and they all had slaves and all this kind of stuff, that they wrote a document and then they codified a structure around it called the Constitution that allowed us to, as Lincoln would say, live into our better angels, to become more than what history would have allowed us to be. So that slavery can be abolished, so that Jim Crow can be done away with, so that the great liberal project that is best typified in the American experiment could yield someone like me sitting where you are, who came out of nothing, one-parent home, Montgomery, Alabama, racist context, dark skin, should not, from what I'm told, have made it into a owning my own home, a professor with, higher academic degrees, with a wife of 10 years and 2 beautiful children and financial stability. And I could go on. Like my ancestors, this was inconceivable. But we have fundamental values, again, articulated in the Declaration of Independence, codified in the Constitution, that made my life possible. And so I think that I have to struggle with that. And I think that everybody else that looks like me has to struggle with that. At the same time, I think we have to struggle with the fact that there are such large disparities between people that look like me typically and people that look more white. I think that we have to struggle with the state of our inner city communities that live around our country. I think about Chicago or Detroit or Birmingham, Alabama, and I've been in these communities. I've served these communities at length. I've taught in an inner city school before, high school, 9 through 12th grade. I've served in a local community centers through churches, and I see the life that these families, these individuals, and these kids, as my reference point, are living. And it's not a life that anyone would ask for. And that they are predominantly black and brown, like, that's a problem. That's a problem. And what I care about is not posturing what feels like, and I can so easily posture and leverage my personal identity, Eric Parker's personal identity, because it will get me somewhere in our current moment. My minority status actually affords me more cultural and political power right now than it does you, because you're lighter than me, and than it does the average white person that lives next door. I can so easily take advantage of that and use easy solutions, easy diagnoses of why it is that so many people in the inner cities are black. But that may or may not help those black people. And if I really want to help those black people that I've seen, that I've taught, that I've looked in the eyes when they tell me that their brother was shot and gunned down, that both their parents were killed, and that they have no one left, do I want to help that person, or do I want to help myself? Because I can help myself and stay affluent and stay comfortable and maybe actually become more affluent by communicating a certain view of the world and a certain set of solutions. But whether or not that's actually accurately descriptive of what's going on, that's what I care about. And so I think we have to wrestle with that. I mean, I could go on, but I don't know if you want to.
Man, so what I'm hearing there is, your heart for that is on display. And I'm hearing that there's a dismissiveness that can come from really either side of the aisle, so to speak,
That's
if
right.
we're going to use that
Right.
political binary. And, maybe on the right, the dismissiveness is something like they did it to themselves. It's their problem. We live out the American dream. It's there for anybody. There's nothing structurally standing in your way.
That's right.
Work harder. So I don't have to now feel any sort of sympathy for what someone is going through. Or the other side, possibly leveraging so that's interesting, plugging in almost the minority status as one of the intersectional power attributes that, but pretending that you're not benefiting from that.
That's right.
Man. So how do you think about addressing those kind of problems, the discrepancies and disparities in the inner city? Do you think structurally about it? Do you think individually about it? Do you think culturally about it? Is it all the above?
That's actually super helpful. All of the above.
Yeah.
Let's see. Culturally, just an easy starting point, because we've already discussed it. There's something wrong culturally when a core value that's not even like obviously put on a wall anywhere, but just comes out spontaneously of black people's mouths from lower income communities, that to like to learn, to love to read, to value education is a white thing. And I'm not white. I don't want to be white. I'm black.
And I assume the logic would be something like there are different knowledge structures, and different societies have different ways of knowing.
Yeah.
And one might be a more empirical way, a scientific method way, what the STEM field uses, empirical research. But because the founders or originators of these kind of concepts, if we say that they're white, which we could get in a whole conversation, what does white even mean?
That's right.
Because that means that there must be some power structure negatively associated with that way of learning.
And so I think you're taking it towards what the academic more elitist side of African Americans who would subscribe or hold to CRT. That's something that that you would hear more associated there. But just in on the grounds, like low income Black communities, it's just a part of the ethos that there's a pride in being Black, which is good. But part of what's connected to that pride is that I'm not white. And what does that mean? Well, part of what that means is that, I don't read like they do. I don't, I don't spend my time doing these certain set of activities. And so hence my experience, and again, not just mine, but multiple other African Americans that I know personally, who you might want, and I don't like this, but who you might say are more Black than me, whatever that means. Just, if I'm biracial, they're fully African American, at least a generation ago, who've had the same experiences. When that's a cultural value, then that has massive ramifications for the rest of their life. And then we talk about the place and role of words, like we spoke about earlier, and that being true of African Americans uniquely. And so it's not then the fault, or at least you'd have to go through great lengths to show that it is, in my mind. It's not then the fault of school teachers or employers or any other sort of supervisory hierarchical person down the road later in life when they are not allowed to advance or they're not allowed to move forward or to obtain certain things like a college degree or get into this school or, get this promotion or even be in a position to be able to get a promotion. It's not their fault, first and foremost, because they looked at what came to them. And if we think that there are certain standards that are important when it comes to education, when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to numbers, then we have to be real about those things.
And I think part of the difficulty too is in any culture, social advancement happens by buying into the culture and doing it well and maybe superior to others in the culture. So if it is a cultural norm to speak a certain way, you learn to speak that way, and that's credibility, that's advancement. That's
and so a CRT minded person would want to push back, I think, would want to greatly push back on that and say that is the white dominant power hierarchy and structure that we are being forced to adapt to. And what needs to happen is there needs to be a much broader sort of window of acceptability in terms, and so like we shouldn't have to do that.
Well, there's an is and a not conversation there, and the thing that we haven't talked about is biology, and like that what I laid out there, that's just a biological, psychological fact that you're going to you want to fit in. We're tribal by nature. We want to fit in with the herd, and so it makes sense once the culture is set for whatever reasons, and that's an interaction between all sorts of factors.
But they want to upend that culture because it's oppressive in nature.
The white culture.
That has set the rules of the game for what is valuable, what is beautiful, what is good, so on and so forth, which I hear that and I get that. And there are some categories of society that I think that that's true. But I don't think that you can blanket that over all society. For instance, it has been reported that there have been CRT-minded organizations that have decried things like math and logic as being forms of whiteness.
Hashtag defund STEM or shut down STEM. This was a bit of a movement.
Exactly. And, okay, that's all well and good at a conceptual level, but let's just think practically about that for a moment. If you built a society with that sort of value that devalues these disciplines and their role in society, then what society would that be?
So I'm going to make an analog here out of the spirit of that and not the scale of that to Russia, to Ukraine in the 30s. We have farmers who are oppressors, and we know that because they have more material than these peasants. So we're going to take these productive farmers out of the equation. Okay, we're going to defund STEM, say. And then you have hundreds of million people starve. because you took these people away.
Yeah.
Well, we leveled the playing field, so to speak. We took the oppressors out of the equation, but they were also the, if you're operating within that framework, there wasn't a whole lot of forethought to that.
Yeah, you made an equitable society, but you also made an impoverished society, and you killed millions of people in the process. But to bring it back to this example, there's real world consequences. That's the point. So do we really want to find a cure for cancer? And that's there's many kinds of cancer, but broadly speaking, do we want to find a cure for any kind of cancer? Do we want to colonize not the moon, but Mars, as Elon Musk has sort of set himself to, because we genuinely believe that we're destroying our world and nothing is changing, so we got to have a plan B? Well, I don't necessarily buy fully into that, but
let's say you did.
Let's say that I did. Well, in the framework that delegitimizes STEM research, the STEM fields, that delegitimizes just fundamentally the rules of logic and philosophy, then you don't have the kinds of minds who have been put forward to the level of rigor and nth degree that they need to be to make the sorts of advancements and breakthroughs that are yet to be made and yet to be found. And so how many people are going to suffer? How slow are we going to advance? How little are we going to be able to do before we realize, wait a second, these things are pretty fundamental to.
This has real world application.
This has real world application.
Yeah.
Do we want to solve hunger? Like, do we want to raise people out of poverty? Well, economics is a difficult field. The kinds of mathematics that you have to be able to do the sorts of economic theories and calculations that affect change, right? It's really, really difficult. Yeah. And that's the kind of discipline that can make a difference for the least of these in our society. Yeah. So do we want people to value the mathematics? Do we want them to value the rigor that's involved and put our best at it, no matter what they look like?
And do we want those institutional gatekeepers to seek out the most competent, number-hungry people, or do we want them to seek out the most diverse group of people ethnically?
Yeah.
And which of those is going to produce better results?
And in a hierarchy of values, because you have to have a hierarchy of values. Everyone does, whether you admit it or not. And right now, what we as a society are putting forward is that what is at the top of the hierarchy, like the ultimate vision of good, is diversity. Everything else falls under that in terms of levels of importance. At least that's the rhetoric. I can't say that every CRT theorist thinks that.
I would say diversity, equity, and inclusion seem to be the three that are closely connected.
Yeah, absolutely. If that's the case, then you will necessarily settle for lower levels of skill, lower levels of accomplishment, and lower levels of ability. And therefore, you will have a slower rate of progression on any metric that you choose because of that.
Except for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Honestly,
you hit those benchmarks.
Honestly, and I haven't fully fleshed this thought out, but I would challenge even that. I would say that that this is a thing that will eat itself. And I think the history of the world attests to this. Like anywhere you think about the Balkans, the Balkanization, people talk about that word, comes out of, what was it, like the 30s, from Europe and this Balkan area, and these groups of racial identities were being pit against one another to fight for resources, and it decimated that region, and that part of Europe, and this has happened again and again through various regimes in the 20th century. And so I think just being a student of history tells us that this doesn't go well when we accentuate our differences and make those the fundamental identifiers, the fundamental issues that in a pluralistic society.
Yeah.
Like pluralism doesn't work. It will eat itself alive, and it will devolve into power, ultimately.
What it seems like is happening, e pluribus unum.
Yeah.
Original vision, if you want to grant that.
Yeah.
Okay, out of many, one.
Yeah.
And then an era of practically shifting from that to an e pluribus pluribus, out of many, many. And originally the school systems were designed to funnel this large group of immigrants and native folks into the vision of the American.
Yeah.
After school programs, everything designed for that. The sports, the pledge, whatever it was. then there became an awakening of sort. And this, a lot of this is, I took a class, the history and philosophy of American education. Sounds super boring, but it was absolutely awesome.
Yeah.
Through the lens of the American educational system, what are the philosophical,
John
political
Dewey
changes?
was a big part of
Sure.
this.
Yeah, exactly. So then there becomes this e pluribus pluribus model, which up until recently I think had been the reigning model, and it almost feels like it's coming back around to an e pluribus unum. But what that unum is, what that end goal of the thing that should be produced from the educational system has changed.
Yeah.
So out of many is this woke archetype of diversity, equity, inclusion, informed and shaped by critical race theory. So there is a desire to now unite around an unum, but it's maybe different perspective.
Yeah. There's a few other things I think are worth talking about, and that, concern me, keep me up at night sometimes. So yes, it is an issue of, on one side, we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We got this American dream. This is the kind of equality that we have sought for. But they miss seeing these communities and the plight that they're in and the role of community. So, which we ought not to miss. This shouldn't be something that is lost on us. I mean, if you think about the great books, right? You have Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, this great travel log, as he was this French lawyer who had sort of been commissioned under one set of reasons, but really coming to America in the 1830s and 1840s to sort of figure out, like, what's all this dynamism all about? Like, what's going on over there that they are excelling? Because no one thought that was going to happen. I mean, you're not far from the Revolutionary War, of course. This ragtag country sort of has actually managed to put something together. And so he comes back and he writes we kind of put all these travelogues together and his observations about America. And one of the big things that he notices is that part of the American ethos is this this spirit of volunteerism. These communities look out for one another.
Yeah, which only happens when you're bought into a greater ideal.
Right. They're not
collectively.
looking for someone or something else to fix the drainage ditch in their community. They are coming together and saying, "Hey, we got a problem. Let's all go grab our shovels, and we're gonna get this set up."
And they had time to do that because they were all drawing government unemployment, which freed them up to.
Yeah, no,
That wasn't happening yet.
because the drainage ditch was their responsibility.
Okay.
It was in their community, their responsibility, and it directly impacted the farmer down the road and how much water he was able to funnel to his crops, which then directly impacted the people who then would buy those crops and eat the corn and eat the lettuce or whatever else.
Yeah.
And so there was communal buy-in, and then as the
Of course, the thinness of that infrastructure also meant they were that much closer to dying at any moment.
100%.
But
yes.
continue, yes.
As the community continues to thicken and expand, you have local associations like churches, and more modern associations would be not only churches but synagogues or mosques or these informal but voluntary associations where people come together and they look out for the common good of one another. And churches oftentimes in obviously 19th century America were the center of community at that point. And they really played a significant role in the formation of the family, of the protection of the community, of building value and assets, building schools for kids, building hospitals for the sick. This wasn't the government, the American government wasn't big enough to do anything like this at the time, right? But in that same context, then, you had real relationships in which people knew one another, and families looked out for families. Kids played together, and moms and dads and aunts and uncles were there, but it was also just straight neighbors, and they might even discipline other kids, and this was a community project. The old adage of it takes a village to raise a family. Well, no one relies on a village anymore because of things like globalization and others, but we know this as Americans, right? And yet conservatives pretend that this isn't a factor in people's development. So when you look at an inner city community And you see the breakdown of the family. You see the breakdown not just of the family as the fundamental building block, but just the community in general. These fundamental dynamics are not going on not at least not robustly. You know, there's always matriarchs in a community that are there, and they're snatching kids off the street and you know, yanking them by the ear and telling them to get it straight, you know, boy. But there's always those other influences that are pulling them back into the street, right? Because the communities have broken down. And that has an impact on what each individual in the community thinks they can do. But it also, to use the term that an economist, Glenn Lowry, coined, you know, he got his PhD from MIT. He's one of the top economists in the world. He also happens to be black. He coined the term social capital. And this is, in economic theory, it's not just that we can use sort of objective, logical decision-making theory to understand people and the economic system in the world, but there's also this other aspect to society, or to economics rather, that is social. In that, you know, for instance, if you or I maybe get into some financial trouble, we have layers of community that we can turn to for some level of financial assistance,
not least
social
of which
assistance,
is the church
psychological assistance, emotional assistance, that starts with our wife, goes to one of our two sets of parents, then maybe aunts or uncles, maybe grandparents from there. Then it goes to maybe our church, if we have a church.
And I would even put personally my church above most of my family members in terms of...
And for some people, that's the case. But there are so many layers for us before we run out of options. And we say we've got nothing. And we have to turn to something like welfare or some sort of government-assisted sort of system. And so this is something that conservatives, in my mind, in my estimation, don't do a good job, if at all, talking about or recognizing.
You think it's because they are blinded by the immense social safety nets they have, and if they would just assume that if I have these, why can't everyone, or why doesn't everyone have these?
I think, honestly, I don't know. I can't comment. It's hard to say. But that it's lacking in the discourse is abundantly clear, at least to me it is. And so I think conservatives need to do a better job of understanding that. I mean, this is a notion that goes as far back as Aristotle. I mean, you read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and he talks about the virtuous life, and that the end of all of life is to be moved towards the good, which for today, if you're a Christian, you might say that's God or something. But for Aristotle, it wasn't necessarily God. It was just the highest end of virtue to which all things were created and point.
Which some might say, you could say is definitionally God.
Yeah. And that's great. And so that you should live a virtuous life no matter what your circumstances are. But even he recognizes that your ability to lead a virtuous life, partly typified in intellectual assent, knowledge, that's a big part of what it means to lead the virtuous life, and to reach the good. Even he would say that while you can, it is difficult and maybe in some cases not even possible. And so this is not something that we in the West should be like scratching our heads over and calling it a liberal or democratic idea or notion. What becomes important is then how do we address those things? But that they are and that they're important and significant is it feels undeniable, at least to me, especially coming out of of an inner city myself. And so some other things that are important. We talked about equity, inclusion, equity and equality, two different social visions of America.
And I would say both fairly semantically loaded terms, especially equity. This is a term you even find in the Bible. So, to just dismiss equity out of hand, I think the issue with that word is that it has a social meaning at this day and age the prevalent social meaning has strayed from maybe an original meaning, which was more synonymous with equality.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
So as it is now, though, I think it is good to draw a distinction between those. So how do you define those visions?
Yeah, the best I can tell, again, just from armchair reading, is that equality in the liberal project and classical liberalism is basically equality of opportunity. That is, that the government and people are not going to place an hindrance in front of you to keep you from obtaining as much prosperity as you yourself can achieve. Okay?
Okay. So the equality as to live up to your personal aptitudes. Because someone might say, well, everyone's starting at different places anyway. So
And
there's
that,
no
and
such
that
thing as
come,
equality.
that'll come in with the equity discussion.
Okay.
But the vision, the classical liberal vision of the Declaration of Independence is the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, and so the government's role is to basically get out of the way and let you live as you please, and it's up to you what you do with your autonomous freedom. And if you can carve out for yourself, a plot of land, we're thinking back to the 18th century, 19th century. If you can carve out
You
for
have a
yourself,
somewhat romantic view of the American dream.
if you can carve out for yourself a plot of land, and you can build yourself a cabin, and you can raise some cattle or whatever else, and you should be able to do that. You should be able to have as big a farm as you want, and then you get to the industrial era, and if you can organize individuals together to produce certain goods, and then you should be able to do that and get the benefits, the top end of the benefits, because you take the top end of the risk in that. And so you yourself are your limit. Not the government, not another person. That's equality of opportunity. There's no limit to your opportunity except for yourself.
Okay. What about limits that would involve? What about limits that would kick in when your personal growth starts to impinge upon the rights of other people?
Yeah. So this develops through American history. So pre-Revolutionary War, you had someone like Thomas Hobbes, or John Locke would be my favorite, I guess.
That's your boy.
He's my boy. Who frames out that we all live according to the law of nature. And the law of nature, essentially, for Locke, was that we would not harm ourselves or anyone else or their property or their stuff. But within that, then we live in a state of nature. That is complete freedom. The problem is when people don't always jive with that, I guess.
Well, the devil's in the details as to what harm means. We see that even. Were you harmed by someone calling you a racial slur?
Back then, no, that's not even conceivable.
Okay, well, what if it was put into your mind and your perceptual scheme that if someone calls you a racial slur, Eric, that that is the end of the world, and that is a horrible thing, and you therefore internalize that in a way that does actually physiologically affect you. This is certainly the case. And okay, well, was that physical harm? All that to say, that's part of the complication of defining what, and this is what they run into with hate speech, and where do you draw the line with this kind of thing, and free speech, and
yes, I think that is definitely a complicating factor.
Okay.
I think the burden is on the individual who claims that they have been harmed through speech that manifested in a physiological way and is therefore physical and is therefore actually more closely associated with the formal or historical definition of harm. Mm-hmm. I think the burden of proof is on them. And I also think that there are a myriad of other societal factors that have thinned out the individual's ability to, what's the word that I'm looking for? Dexterity to
sort of to withstand those pressures, or
yes, I think the best psychologists would say that you don't grow in your ability to tolerate and push through adversity by limiting adversity. It's actually exposure to the difficult things in life that strengthen your ability to maintain resolve and to persevere in the midst of difficulty.
And we could link to Haidt's coddling of the American mind.
That's right. So if you are feeling that you can't hear certain speech because it is giving you psychological trauma or difficulty, then you have larger problems that will manifest themselves eventually, apart from someone speaking to you.
And I may answer that they're cultural problems, because one way I've thought about it is, say for a period of time, people's emotional cup was about halfway full. So they had a little bit of area when someone came at them to fill it. They're not going to overflow in anxiety or depression or this negative emotion. But say you live in a society that's structured as such that you are on the emotional fritz at all time, and that cup is full to the brim. So here comes someone that looks at me the wrong way. From time to time, our cup is up there, and you can feel the sensitivity and the open nerves. But I feel like as a whole, the society's cups are full. Yeah. And then you add to that other cultural phenomena and current events and things that just, if you're watching the news, they're trying to fill your cup up to the top. That's good for ratings, and they're trying to, if you're watching commercials, they're trying to fill you up with stuff you don't have and this kind of stuff.
That's funny. My wife and I have been watching Disney Plus's The Benedict Society or something like that.
Yeah.
The Mysterious.
We're watching.
And they have the emergency that's going on. So the news is constantly on, or TV at least is constantly on, and people are at greater levels of anxiety. The world's coming to an end. Everyone's super pessimistic, and there's obviously some social commentary going on. And I won't spoil everything that's going on, but just if you're looking for a cultural representation of someone trying to raise a flag on exactly what you're talking about.
And the one great thing about that particular example is it's called the emergency. It's this vague thing because it's from the perspective of kids. And as far as they're concerned, or kids in our society now, it's not like they have their pulse on specific political things that are happening. It's an emergency. Everyone's stressed. My parents are stressed. These people are stressed. We don't know why, but I'm stressed.
That's right.
So I think that's a very wise depiction.
So there's equality of opportunity, that the notion of that advances and gets more filled out, codified, restricted in some ways, augmented, even contradictory as you move well into the 20th century.
Let me add one other thing. Even starting at the beginning, equality of opportunity also meant on the justice side of things, you get what you deserve.
Yeah.
Okay, so that idea is there along with it negatively. Yeah. So when you're up against the law, presumably, in concept, you get what you deserve.
Yes.
Because that'll play into maybe the equity.
Yes, equality under the law, so that your race, your sexual identity, and so on and so forth. The Civil Rights Act essentially helped us to sort of formalize, codify this, which is really important legislation that people had fought for. Women, minorities, to some degree, although it wouldn't be realized later, homosexuals, fought for this to happen, right? And now it's sort of being made suspect. But that you stand before a judge and there's a case, and what is not legitimate in assessing the validity of your rightness or wrongness is what you look like, or what your religious preferences are, or what your sexual preferences are, or whatever else. That's not okay in that scenario, because the country was used to that actually being one of the fundamental things that was taken into consideration. I think about To Kill a Mockingbird, right? That's fictional depiction of probably lots of real life instances that happened in the South and Alabama, even in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, where in a courtroom you have a black man that barely gets a white man to defend him, and it's almost a foregone conclusion that he was guilty just because he was black, right? So all to say. Then you have equity, which is different from equality, and your average person who hasn't thoughtfully read on this subject probably is listening to me now and would have said that those are synonymous.
Yes, I want to be on the side of equity.
Who doesn't?
Yeah.
And that's one of the brilliant parts of critical race theory is it actually employs lots of familiar words and sometimes uses the same word that we would use in a classical liberal framework, but with a fundamentally different meaning, almost like a Trojan horse
Would
type of
social
situation.
justice be another example of that? We don't have to go off on
No,
defining.
I don't know. I mean, you can maybe make the case to me, and I'd be, open to that. I don't know that I would have thought that, but race and racism would be.
Sure.
Broadening
out the term.
Race is much broader than what most people would tell you, and racism is definitely much broader, and often goes under a different name under CRT nowadays. But all I say.
Okay.
So equity is one of those same kind of words that sort of slips in as sounding innocuous. Actually, not even just innocuous, but positive. Like
biblical.
Everybody wants equity.
Yeah.
We want equality. What's the difference?
Mm-hmm.
But equity, if equality is that, I read this from a guy who he and a few others wrote this book called Cynical Theories, Dr. James Lindsay. Mathematician by training, which you might dismiss him for that, but honestly, it gives him the bona fides because what's consistent between philosophy and math is logic. And so he's read, I think, almost in total, all the major works of both CRT and the philosophical framework that it emerges from the critical school that comes out of the Frankfurt School.
Okay, so he's also going into postmodernism.
Yes.
Marxism.
Yes. So he's spent the better last at least 5 years working on all of this, from someone who's had to go through the rigor of a competitive PhD program, not just a competitive PhD program, but one in the hardest field, at least from my mind, that there is, mathematics.
He's really taking one for the team.
Yeah. And so he wrote this book called Cynical Theories. He has a book called, or a website, he and some others have a website called New Discourses, where he devotes a good bit of time talking about critical race theory and some other things. And so I was reading some of that, trying to prepare for this. And just to be clear, like, I've got a couple of main texts from critical race theory. Like, I've got like the big red book, if you're listening and you're familiar with critical race theory, and then I've got just a quick little introduction, which was actually written by two professors out of a law school near here at the University of Alabama. So they're kind of close to home. So I've read that in its total, and I've read articles out of the big anthology, and so all it say, Lindsay, not being a critical race theorist, but talks about what is equity versus equality. And if equality is that, how does he say it, that if person A and person B are in this situation, this is going to be very inarticulate, then, as I said before, they are the limit to their own advancement, but they have equality of opportunity, basically. Equity is the notion that person A and person B, through various reasons, are not equal in their situations. It boils down to basically the difference between equal opportunity and equal outcomes. So that we socially engineer so that person A and person B have equal outcomes. And that is the fundamental framework for equity. And so the way that they think about it is, hey, there's been all this negative stuff, this bad stuff, this disenfranchisement. You think about the history of slavery. You think about licensing laws that were the precursor to Jim Crow laws, and just disadvantage after disadvantage, generational wealth, redlining. You just fill in the blank with all of these kind of historical disadvantages that basically mean that, for me, if there's a starting line in this race in life, and the starting line is quote unquote equal opportunity, then I'm actually starting about 100 yards back, and I don't start in the same place that you do. And so how can you really call that equal opportunity? I don't have the same access to education. I didn't have the same fill in the blank. And so what we need to do then is to take proactive action. This is where affirmative action.
Harvard's emission scandal.
Yes. So yes, the notion that I've been disadvantaged from all of this historical sort of things going on, and so therefore we need to involve certain governmental political policies like affirmative action, which you can see in lots of different institutions, Harvard being one of those, that puts race or ethnicity at the top end of the factoring into admissions. And what's interesting about the Harvard scandal is that Asian for sure, but specifically, you remember, is it Korean?
I don't remember the specifics.
So forgive me, I'm thinking Korean, but just more broadly speaking, Asians filed a suit against Harvard because they were basically not being allowed in, even though they had the best qualifications to Harvard, because they were overrepresented at Harvard. And so in order to make Harvard a more inclusive and diverse place, they actually denied a bunch of Asian students, and this was clear from all the documents that had been sort of brought out in this entire trial.
Yeah.
And so affirmative action actually working negatively, and in that case, it's somewhat legitimized from a CRT perspective because Asians, at least if they're Korean specifically, they are probably seen as white adjacent. So that basically means that they're not white, but they're close enough that they get kind of the benefits of being white, and so they don't actually count as a marginalized or oppressed minority.
Yes.
As opposed to seeing like these are immigrants that came and went from nothing to like something. But I mean,
and a closer example would be someone who has dark skin, black skin, that came from the Caribbean or something like that, say, who on the just visually would be indistinguishable from a native born.
That's right.
But demographically earns much higher.
Yeah. So just to finish the point on equity, it's about equality of outcomes and engineering things in such a way that truly make society a more level playing field, if you will, with little attention paid to the kind of persons that then get those benefits and what's good or right truly for them, and secondarily maybe good and right for those institutions as being a bulwarks of our society. Like, we need Harvard to have the best. It's great if like lots of other schools that aren't Harvard or an Ivy League have really great people too. But we need places that have elite, and it's not just an elite place, but they truly have the best. We also, as a society, should care about those elite being partially made up of minorities, of blacks. That's important. Yeah. But to cut out maybe the middle part of that, where in the first category of equality, like a black person like myself rightly found my way there, just like the white person next to me or the Korean or whatever, that has large ramifications both on that institution and on the future of that person. But yes, then you have the issue of disparities. Disparities are one of the foundational epistemological bulwarks, if you will, to CRT, because they seem to ostensibly automatically prove that our society is systemically racist, which or institutionally or structurally racist. These are all kind of varying degrees. But that the society is built in such a way that holds certain people back. And so disparities are like, well, look at this disparity, look at this disparity, look at this disparity.
And the idea would be disparity equals discrimination.
And in disparity equals discrimination. That is the fundamental assumption, even in some of our Supreme Court decisions that have been made. That if there's not a certain parity between blacks and whites in cases that have come before us, then there is discrimination going on. That's the assumption, which is just lazy if you're a statistician or a social scientist to think the fundamental axiom of statistics or of social science is that correlation does not equal causation.
Yeah.
That's fundamental.
Yeah.
And so if that's true, then might I take a closer look at some of these disparities and see all the variance and dynamics going on at play, so that something like when you look at people from the West Indies or West Africans and their role in our society, not just first generation, because then the argument is, oh, they're the best and the brightest, of course, so they're going to succeed. But you look at second generation, first generation, you might say, well, white people hear their accents, and so they treat them differently than like, sort of native generational African Americans that have been here for generations, trace their heritage back to slavery kind of thing. You look at second generation West Indies, and they are doing, on the average, I want to say the numbers are like 30% better in income distribution. Not as good, I don't think, as whites, but 30% better than that generational native-born African American. And so,
do you know the numbers on the third generation?
I don't.
From what I've seen, the numbers start to get closer to the native-born, which is interesting, and I think that has to do with cultural assimilation that's going on.
That may be true,
Yeah.
but it's
your
not
point stands.
insignificant
Right.
that if our society truly has these structures in place, then it doesn't matter how good or competent the West Indies person is versus the African American, native-born person, because it's not based on that.
Yeah.
Apparently, you're being weeded out just by how you look, right? Just by your sort of appearance. There's another subgroup of African Americans. If you are an African American and you are married, then there's a great disparity between how many of you are in low income bracket, like below the poverty line kind of thing, and how many of you are not. And it's actually on parity to the white distribution
Of white married
couples. So if you're a white married couple and you're a black married couple, then you have the same likelihood, as it were. And forgive me, because I'm not a statistician, so I may be saying that in the wrong way, but you have the same likelihood of being impoverished, which is like, I want to say 7.3% or something like that, of couples who are married, white or black, fall in that or whatever.
Yeah.
Or if you're black and you grew up in a home and you had books and a library card, then you are far more likely to not be below the poverty line. Or take this, for example, in New York City, you have this conglomeration of charter schools. These are public schools that act as private, so anyone can go to them. They have public funds, but you have to get in. Not anybody can just go to them in that sense. And most of these schools work on a lottery sort of framework. So it's not based on how smart you are or like who you know or whatever. It's like literally pull your name out of a hat. And a lot of these waiting lists have like 15,000 people or something on them. I don't know. That might be an exaggeration, but it's a lot. It's like an incomprehensible number that is basically no hope. The only thing that might distinguish a minority black kid that gets in this case, I'm getting this information from Thomas Sowell, who's a famous economist who also happens to be black, who wrote this book called Discrimination Disparities, and he talks about the Success Academy schools. And in 2013, the New York Times surveyed and looked at these schools and these minority kids who got in based on lottery. The only thing distinguishing them from other impoverished minority black kids in New York City being that their parents cared enough to try to get them into the school by putting them on the waiting list, and then they literally won the lottery. That's the only thing that distinguishes them. The New York Times said that students from these schools in 2013, I think I'm remembering the date right, they outscored the best schools, but particularly the most affluent and most white schools in New York State at that time or whatever. They were outscoring. And so the question is, if we live in this racist society that is fundamentally racist and has structures that are weeding out all of these people, then why is it that some groups of black people which you would think if people are racist, then it doesn't matter what you do. If you look black, then you're not getting anywhere. I need someone, and this is genuine, I need someone from a critical perspective, a critical theory sort of perspective, to help me understand the substantial rationale for why that can happen and why that can exist. Why in the society still be fundamentally, structurally racist. And I'll just maybe kind of come to an end. I don't know how many more questions you have, but the reason I can even think about this is because I just wrestle with the tension in my own life and my own soul. I've experienced overt forms of racism. I'm being told that, these more subversive structural things are worse than these overt forms I've experienced and that my grandparents experienced when they grew up and lived through the Civil Rights era in Montgomery, Alabama. That's what I'm told, but I've experienced these things, and they were painful and they hurt. And I've thought about like what that might mean for my kids. My kids actually are pretty light skinned, but I thought about like, if they had been dark skinned, what that would have been for them. Would they have experienced the same things? That was a challenge even for my broader family as I met my wife and we contemplated what it would mean for us to be together. So I don't want to dismiss that, but at the same time, I do not feel that I've ever had anything holding me back from achieving all that I could achieve. The only time that I might say that would have been true is when I lived in Montgomery, Alabama, in the inner city, and was rezoned from a good school that was diverse and middle class, even though I wasn't middle class, to the school that was in my neighborhood that was predominantly black, where in that year that I was there, before we moved to a different county, which is what happens if you have any means at all or any social safety net from your family, which is my grandparents helped us to do that, then you have school choice. That is, you move from, right? But that year that I was there, I was under threat, it felt like every day, from the black kids in the school. They were going to beat me up, steal my stuff. I remember vividly like being chased on my bicycle because they wanted to take what do you call those? I hadn't said it in so long. Basically the rims off my bike. I went to school in fear every day. I saw my black teacher die in front of me from a heart attack.
No way.
In a classroom that, I don't know how old this building was, but it was not up to code at all. And our books were old. And so being forced, if I didn't have the family, the grandparents that allowed us to move out to the country, as it were, and actually end up having a better educational experience, a more diverse experience, then I would have been forced into that situation. That system would have kept me there.
So that might be an example of a systemic issue.
That's, to me, that's a clear
counter.
systemic problem that I can't say is fundamentally racial, because there's white kids that find themselves in West Virginia in broken educational systems, right?
My father-in-law had that situation with, he was bused into a community where he was under physical threat, ate his lunches in the bathroom, etc. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the closest time in my life that I think I can point to as feeling that I didn't have all the opportunities in the world in front of me, that the sky was the limit. That was the darkest part of my childhood, for other reasons too, but for sure, it scares me to think, had I had to stay in that community, I had no options, and my world would have been so limited in terms of the possibilities. But from a Christian perspective, I have to say, by the grace of God, for no merit of my own, he saw fit, through actually a really terrible circumstance with my brother, to move us out of that community into the country of all places, which was really odd for me. But it gave me not a great education. So on math and reading scores across the state of Alabama, this school would have scored around the 50th percentile plus or minus 10 points, which is not great. My kids, for instance, are going to go to a school where they will score within the top 10 or top 5 percentile, if all things go well, I suppose. But it gave me a chance. It gave me the school that I was going to. I just looked this up recently. it would have been more in like the 18 percentile of math and reading scores. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
so I've had to wrestle personally with how is it that I, for all intents and purposes, a black man, having experienced overt and explicit racism, at the same time, like as much as maybe I might want to sometimes play the card, can't in good conscience do so. Like I have every opportunity in front of me, and I've got a lot of ambition left. Like I want to do big things in the world because I want to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm striving for every day, and it doesn't feel like I'm losing. So
That is awesome. And I think that's a great place to end that particular part of the conversation. That's awesome, man. And I hope people really take that seriously, especially those who have been told that they are victims of the system and don't have the power to do it. Or if they are actually victims of a system that does have them under the thumb, that they can do all that is in their power to change that.
let me say just one more thing. That system that I was just talking about, that's real.
Yeah.
And it perpetuates poverty. It perpetuates the outcomes that we hate so much that cause these disparities. And I think we should care deeply about doing something about that. Because education in our context, with our creed, it is the golden ticket out of poverty, to break the cycle, to start new and afresh, to build wealth, to do something that maybe generations of your family couldn't do. And so for my money, I want to look at these communities, and I want to focus on education, and I want to focus on relationships in communities, because I think Tocqueville was right, a couple hundred years ago. Like, we need to recapture that in the most broken places in our country. If we can do that, I think we'll see the landscape fundamentally change.
It's brilliant. So I'm going to rapid fire some lighter questions.
Let's
here.
do it.
All right. So first question here. What are you looking forward to currently?
Oh, what am I looking forward to? Oh, goodness. I am looking forward to the semester starting. I'm a professor, and I love what I do. I love these students. Their minds are just so ready and excited, and I get the opportunity to just broaden their world and expose them to things they've never thought about and challenge them to be lifelong learners. So I'm pretty pumped.
That's awesome. And you'll be teaching the missiology class for the first time, right?
I'll be teaching that for the first time along with some other classes.
Awesome. Coffee or tea?
Oh, man. The Anglophile in me. I love all things England. Definitely has, like, tea as oh, man, like, I just wish I was that kind of person. I've tried it. I go through periods where I try it, and try to do that. I feel like you're a tea person. But coffee is...
It's like one time someone told me that they feel like I'm a vegetarian. So I feel like that's a similar type of compliment, question mark?
It is. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I wish I was that person. But no, coffee is the thing that I enjoy. I'm learning to like tea.
Gotcha. That's funny. The Anglophile and you drawn to the tea, yet there's this other part of you that wants grape soda or something. I'm just kidding. Thought about not saying that. All right. The TV show you're watching right now?
Oh, yeah. So... my wife and I just finished watching a show called Blind Spot. We are watching the Mysterious Benedict Society, which is pretty good. We just finished watching Loki, which was started out like okay, ended pretty great.
Okay.
I feel like I'm missing something really good. Okay, it's not coming to mind, but yeah, those are the things kind of on the docket right now.
Awesome. What kind of music is on your playlist?
Honestly, I don't listen to music that much, which is funny because I'm a former musician. I thought that my life would be about music. Played for a long time, different instruments, but for the last probably 15 years, I've had a steady diet of podcasts and lectures and things as I drive, because there's just too much to learn. There's too much to learn and not enough time. And if I've got an hour in the car, 30 minutes, that's
time.
Really important time, because there's too much work to be done. The world has lots of problems, and I really feel that I can be a part of helping to fix or ameliorate some of those problems. And but I unfortunately didn't get the best education in some ways, and so I'm having to educate myself.
I heard that. And yeah, the way I think about that, it's like if you know this much, say the tip of my finger, the circumference of that is what you realize that you don't know. And then as you grow in knowledge, say to my fist, that circumference grows. And so the more you grow, it's like maybe filling up a balloon.
Yeah.
You go, man, I don't know
man.
too much stuff I don't know.
Oh, my goodness. There's so many things that like I'm aware of and I can follow, but I couldn't articulate in front of you because I don't have enough knowledge to you know, so.
There's a bit of an urgent FOMO of all life's knowledge, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there anything that's frustrating you right now? We talked about a few of these things, but any particular thing that's a thorn in the side of sorts?
Oh, goodness. You know, what we didn't talk about was what is it? Is Federalist 10 or 51 Federalist Papers? You know, kind of these newspaper articles written by some of the framers of the Constitution, in an appeal to the body politic to adopt the Constitution. In one of the two, I can't remember which one it is, they talk about the role of factions and how the Constitution is uniquely designed to mitigate the influence of factions, basically, and to in some ways even use factions against themselves. The two-sided factional nature of our society between Republicans and Democrats, I mean, that's frustrating, especially the low resolution version of those arguments presented through mainstream media, and then the polluted resolution arguments presented through social media.
Have you heard Jonathan Haidt's take on some of the exacerbation of the political divide?
Quite possibly.
He lays a lot of it at Newt Gingrich's Republican Party. So you'll have to...
I feel like I remember reading something about that.
Yeah. Anyway, for what that's worth. If there was a book that you could force the government to put in the mailbox of every American as required reading, what would it be? I've never asked the question that way. What book would you recommend? But I think that's an interesting way to frame it.
Goodness.
We'll talk about the abuse of government power.
Well, you know, for me, this may not be obvious to everybody, but in my circles, this is obvious. The Bible.
Okay.
but you know, and this sounds a little Christian nationalist. I don't want it to sound this way, but just because we've lost civic education, I would put the Constitution probably next. Not because I think this is God's country. So disconnect.
But you'd wrap them together with an American flag and put them
Oh, absolutely. No, not at all. Okay. But just because I'm a Christian, I think the most fundamental things in life can't be boiled down to politics. Okay. And are so much more transcendent than that. But then push that to the side for a moment. Then I think the next most, not most important relationship, but framework that we have to wrestle with every single day is where we exist in our country. Yeah. And what is our country and what's it supposed to be and what's it supposed to do and what was it meant to be. And I think most people just haven't read the Constitution, let alone the Federalist Papers, to see like this uniquely, amazingly designed document that has yielded what it has, and that how slow we need to be before we amend it or especially toss it out. Like, you know, I think CRT, just to come back to that, they want to, you know, toss out the baby of liberalism with the bathwater of racism. You know, like that's kind of what they are attempting to do. And I want to say no. Like, liberalism is our best hope for seeing advancement along every line that we care about, for disparities and discrimination and racism and so many other things. Like, it's not, these things don't exist because we have bought too much into liberalism. They exist because we have not bought enough into liberalism. And so if I could help us as a country understand that, I think the book would be the Constitution. And I would just, if I could then talk to everyone, I would just walk them through the parts that I understand and then lean on the parts that on other people who understand them better, who are qualified to explain the parts that I don't fully understand. So
it's good. All right, 2 more questions.
Okay.
And they're linked. If you could have dinner with any male, living or past, who would it be, and what would you eat?
Okay. Goodness. Again, the obvious answer in my circles would be Jesus, because I do believe that he existed and was real, and ate things. So that would be great. But
and if not, the hypothetical would at least prove or disprove that contended
but
reality.
I'm gonna put Jesus to the side because there may be a lot of people listening that's not even like a legitimate option. So, so I think I can't give you one, but I can give you two.
We can join twins.
Winston Churchill.
Okay.
So if you're of a certain mind, you've already canceled me. But I challenge you to read is it Alistair Roberts? A recent biography of Churchill. It is phenomenal. I think he's the kind of person that maybe, on the first several meetings you might not have liked because he was very bombastic and just in your face. But giving the benefit of the doubt, getting past the rough exterior, he was a wonderfully fascinating, erudite individual who it would not be a far cry to say saved the world. So he would be amazing to sit down and eat with. The other person would be C.S. Lewis. Lived around a similar period of time.
Is that a conversation that you'd want both of them at that dinner?
Oh, yes.
That'd be fascinating, huh?
Yes, 100%. That would be phenomenal. I mean, I'd love to get one-on-one time with each of them and talk, because, Churchill wasn't he wasn't what you'd call a conservative Christian at best. So that conversation might be a little bit hijacked by that fact. So I'd like to have them separate, but definitely together would be amazing. And probably either like a really good prime rib or like a Wagyu kind of steak or whatever. Some Brussels sprouts or some mashed potatoes definitely. And whatever my favorite drink is.
Okay.
So
that's good. And then last question here. Same thing, dinner, but you're taking a female to dinner. Past, present. You can exclude your wife from this. We'll take that off the table. We know that's the obvious answer.
Okay, good.
And who is it? And what are you eating?
Okay. Because it would 100% be my wife.
Oh, yes. Well,
we just passed the 10-year mark, and I am more in love with her today than I ever thought possible, especially the first day or the day we got married or every day since until today. Like, I love her more. She is an amazing woman, and I can't believe that I get to go home to her in a few minutes. But if it's not her, I would probably say, one immediately came to mind, but now a couple others are coming to mind. I'll just give you the one. I'd probably sit down with Margaret Thatcher. She was an amazing individual.
Okay.
Amazing woman.
What would you guys eat?
Does
she get a steak like the boys?
She gets whatever she wants.
Okay.
And I would parody whatever she eats, just out of respect and deference. So
that's great. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. I learned a lot, and I've got a lot more that I want to think through as a result of this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, man,
I would love to do it again.
This was great. I hope so.
We'll see you next time.